patients regularly report a specific physiological event, waking up at 3 in the morning, wide awake, with an elevated heart rate. The standard clinical assumption treats this as a neurological issue. The diagnosis usually points to a failure of the brain's circadian rhythm architecture or an overactive sympathetic nervous system. The underlying culprit is often isolated from the brain's sleep centers. It is a failure of nocturnal glucose homeostasis, resulting in acute hypoglycemia, a state where blood sugar falls below normal baseline levels. This animated graph illustrates the mechanism. The top axis displays a standard sleep hypnogram, while the bottom tracks blood biochemistry. Watch the glucose trace. When it drops into a hypoglycemic state at 3 a.m., the biological stress system deploys an immediate countermeasure. It triggers a sharp spike in cortisol and adrenaline to mobilize stored glycogen for fuel. That chemical stress response is effective at raising blood sugar, but is incompatible with rest. The adrenaline surge forces the brain out of deep sleep and directly into a waking state. 3 compounds are frequently recommended to resolve this exact pattern of sleep maintenance insomnia: inositol, melatonin, and apigenin. These agents function as systemic metabolic regulators. Addressing sleep maintenance insomnia requires shifting the clinical focus to the patient's metabolic baseline. Inositol is the first intervention used to directly counter the acute midnight glucose crash. Clinical data shows inositol is especially useful for patients who wake up in the middle of the night and struggle to fall back asleep, particularly those who fast for several hours before bed. Inositol operates as a secondary messenger. A secondary messenger is an intracellular molecule that transmits signals from a receptor on the cell's surface to targets inside the cell. Specifically, inositol mediates cellular insulin signaling pathways. By acting on these pathways, inositol significantly decreases fasting plasma glucose and improves overall insulin sensitivity across the system. This improved insulin sensitivity establishes a stable glucose floor. Rather than erratic drops throughout the night, blood sugar maintains a smooth glide path, staying consistently above the threshold that would normally trigger a cortisol response. Because inositol bypasses systemic mass reduction and acts directly on these internal signaling pathways, these improvements in insulin sensitivity occur even when the patient's body weight remains unchanged. By securing this glucose floor, inositol deprives the body of the biological necessity to trigger an emergency sympathetic nervous system awakening. While inositol stabilizes acute nighttime glucose drops, melatonin exerts long-term structural control over systemic insulin. A 2026 meta-analysis published in Nutrition and Metabolism evaluated 30 randomized controlled trials, encompassing over 1,400 subjects, to quantify melatonin's effect on glycemic control. This forest plot details the effect of melatonin on fasting blood sugar. The weighted mean difference diamond at the bottom sits firmly in the negative, showing that melatonin supplementation reduced fasting blood sugar by an average of 2.66 milligrams per deciliter. This second forest plot tracks insulin concentrations. Melatonin drove a significant negative shift of 1.58 micro-international units per milliliter. It also improved HOMA-IR. HOMA-IR is a metric that quantifies insulin resistance based on fasting glucose and insulin levels. This meta-regression bubble plot reveals a clear dose dependency. The downward trend line indicates that the most significant metabolic improvements occurred at doses of 8 milligrams or higher, sustained over durations exceeding 10 weeks. We have to ask how a hormone primarily known for regulating circadian rhythms in the pineal gland alters peripheral blood sugar. The answer lies in its direct action on the liver, adipose tissue, and pancreas. First, melatonin binds directly to MTR1 and MTR2 receptors in the liver. These specific cellular receptors activate intracellular pathways that actively upregulate the synthesis of glycogen, increasing the liver's ability to store glucose. Second, in adipocytes, or fat cells, melatonin facilitates the movement of GLUT4 to the cell membrane. GLUT4 is a transport protein that moves glucose out of the blood and into the cell, actively clearing glucose from the peripheral circulation. Third, in the pancreas, melatonin functions as a localized antioxidant. It shields insulin-producing beta cells from reactive oxygen species, or ROS. ROS are unstable oxygen-containing molecules that cause severe cellular damage and disrupt insulin secretion. Melatonin requires clinical reclassification. It is a metabolic hormone that preserves endogenous insulin function and regulates peripheral glucose, independent of its ability to induce sleep. Melatonin and inositol manage systemic receptor signaling. To complete the protocol, we must scale down to the cellular level to examine the coenzymes that power metabolism. Apigenin is the third compound, offering broad systemic benefits across both lipid and glucose homeostasis. Apigenin's primary metabolic target is CD38. CD38 is a glycoprotein and enzyme that aggressively degrades cellular coenzymes as the body ages, specifically consuming the local NAD+ pool. NAD+ is a coenzyme required for metabolic energy production. This diagram shows the pharmacological mechanism. As CD38 aggressively degrades NAD+ near the mitochondria, apigenin molecules bind to the CD38 receptor. It physically blocks the enzyme's destructive action. The immediate result of this targeted inhibition is the preservation and rapid elevation of the available cellular NAD+ pool. This elevated NAD+ acts as the critical coenzyme for mitochondrial function, driving energy metabolism and actively resisting cellular senescence. By protecting the underlying cellular machinery, apigenin ensures the mitochondria have the energetic capacity required to execute the glucose and lipid homeostasis directed by inositol and melatonin. Human sleep architecture cannot be isolated from human metabolic architecture. Inositol serves as the foundation. It prevents the acute nocturnal crashes that force the sympathetic nervous system to intervene. Melatonin structurally repairs systemic insulin sensitivity and restores peripheral receptor function. Apigenin protects the cell from age-related decline by preserving the NAD+ energy pool. When combined, these three agents regulate the specific metabolic metrics that dictate our resting state. The result is a stable glucose trace, which supports an uninterrupted sleep hypnogram. To support sleep quality and health span, the clinical toolkit must address the nocturnal metabolic baseline.